The third week of her service at Wexmore Hall, Adeline found the locked door at the back of the study, and behind it she found a face she would have sworn was her own. She had come in at dawn to dust the great desk before the master rose, because Mrs. Pine had said the Earl would not have a maid touch his papers, and that a copyist with clean hands and a quiet step was the only one he trusted near them. The fire had burned down to a red eye in the grate. The long room smelled of cold ash and beeswax and the leather of 1,000 book spines, and the light through the tall windows came gray and slow off the autumn lawn. She was reaching to straighten a stack of music when she saw that one panel of the wainscot was not a panel at all, but a narrow door painted to vanish into the wall, its brass keyhole worn bright by use. It was not her place to open it. She knew that the way she knew the cold of the stone passage and the weight of her own plain gray gown. She opened it anyway, because the key was in the lock, and because something in her had been waiting 3 weeks for a reason she could not name. Inside the shallow recess hung a single portrait, no larger than a Bible, draped in black silk. She lifted the silk with 2 fingers. A young woman looked back at her from the canvas, perhaps 20 years old, in a gown of soft sea green, her dark hair dressed simply. The painter had given her a wide, grave mouth and gray eyes set a little too far apart and a small dark mark at the left jaw, just there, where a woman might touch when she was thinking. Adeline's hand rose to her own jaw before she could stop it. The mark was in the same place. The mouth was the same mouth. She was looking at a stranger dead 20 years or more, and the stranger had been given her face. Behind her the study door opened, and a man's voice, low and level and very cold, said, "Put it down." She let the silk fall. She turned. "Pa." The Earl of Wexmore stood in the doorway in his shirt-sleeves, his dark coat over one arm, and for one breath, neither of them moved. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder with black hair gone iron at the temples, and a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, his eyes the gray of slate under rain. She had served 3 weeks in his house, and seen him perhaps 4 times. Always at a distance, always silent, and the whole household spoke of him in the lowered voice people use for the recently bereaved, though no one could say whom he had buried. Now he was close enough to see the muscle working at the hinge of his jaw, and she understood that she had done something far worse than dust a desk without leave. "Forgive me, my lord," she said. Her voice came out steadier than her hands. "The key was in the lock. I had no right." "No," he agreed. "You had not." He crossed the room and closed the small door, and turned the key, and drew it out, and stood with it closed in his fist, as though it were a living thing that might escape him. He did not look at the portrait again. He looked at her face with an expression she could not read, and then something moved behind his eyes and was gone. The way a fish turns, once in deep water, and is lost. "You will not speak of this," he said. "Not to Mrs. Pine, not to the kitchen, not to anyone. In this house, or out of it, I will not. My lord, go." She went. At the door she stopped, because she was Adeline Corvanna, poor and proud her whole life, and had learned early that a person with nothing must at least keep the truth. "My lord," she said, not turning. "The lady in the picture. She has my face." There was a silence so long she thought he would not answer. When he did, his voice had changed, gone rough at the edges like a stone worn by water for a long time. "I know," he said. That is where this story began for her, though she would not understand it for many weeks. If a tale of a woman with nothing who carried only the truth is one you would care to follow to its end, then stay, and watch how the truth made its slow way through a house built to bury it. Adeline had come to Wexmore Hall the way 1,000 gentlewomen of no fortune came to such places, sideways and grateful. Ah! Her father had been a country organist and music master at Hartfell Cross, a learned man with a good ear and no money at all, and when he died of a fever in her 23rd winter, he left her a small chest of his own copied scores, a quarter's unpaid rent, and the single accomplishment of her life, which was that she could read music as easily as speech, and write it out in a clean hand that did not blot. When he was buried, she had asked the music seller for whom she had copied parts at 3p the page for more work, and the man, who was not unkind, had said there was a great house 30 miles off that wanted a copyist for its library, at room, board, and £8 the year, and that she should think herself fortunate. She had thought herself fortunate. She was 24, with no living relation she knew of, no dowry, no patron, and a face that men sometimes looked at twice and then forgot, because a face is no use to a poor woman and may be a danger. She had packed her father's scores and her 2 gowns, and her mother's small silver thimble, the only object of value she owned, and ridden 30 miles on a carrier's cart to a house she had never seen, because the alternative was the parish, and the parish was a kind of death. She did not intend to die. The marriage market, she had thought on that long cold ride, was a sea, and she was a woman without a boat. She permitted herself that one dry observation and no more, for self-pity was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Wexmore Hall rose out of its park like a thing that had grown there, gray stone gone gold in places with lichen, 3 stories under a steep slate roof, with a chapel at one end, older than the rest, and a long avenue of bare autumn limes leading up to the door. The household that ran it was small for so large a house, and old and quiet, and they had all of them the same watchful, faded look, as if they had spent a great many years not saying something. Mrs. Pine, the housekeeper, was a square, kind, formidable woman, with a ring of keys at her waist that did not, Adeline noticed, include the key to the study door. The steward, Sowden, was a white-haired man with a steward's stoop and a soldier's straight gaze, who had been at Wexmore, the kitchen said, longer than the Earl had been alive. They gave her a narrow, clean room under the eaves, set her to the library, and told her almost nothing. What she learned by living there. The Earl was 34 and unmarried, and the county had long since given up hope of him. He rode out before light and came back after dark, and dined alone, and the village called him the Cold Earl, and crossed themselves when his horse went by, not from hatred, but from a kind of pity they did not have the words for. His mother had died when he was a boy of 9, and no one would speak of her, and his father, the old Earl, had died long after, hard and silent, and between those 2 graves something had gone wrong in the house that had never been put right. And she learned that the woman who truly ruled at Wexmore Hall was not the Earl at all, but his aunt, the Dowager Lady Marborne. Lady Marborne was the old Earl's elder sister, widowed young of a baron, and she had come back to her brother's house 40 years before, and never left it. She was perhaps 63, upright as a poker, with a face once handsome and now all bone and will, and she dressed in the gray and jet of perpetual half-mourning for a husband no one remembered. She kept the keys to everything but the study, decided who was hired and who was turned off, and had, the kitchen said, broken 2 housekeepers and a chaplain before Mrs. Pine learned to bend. She had decided within a day of Adeline's arrival that she did not like the new copyist's face. "Maud, you are very forward in your looks, girl," she said the first time Adeline was brought before her, sitting very straight by the fire with a piece of needlework she never finished. "A servant should have a plain countenance and keep her eyes down. There is something bold in your face that I do not care for. To this house you are a pair of clean hands and nothing more. See that you remember it? A pair of clean hands and nothing more." Adeline curtsied and kept her eyes down and remembered it. She had seen the old woman's gaze catch on her face and stop, the way the Earl's had stopped, and she had seen something cross those hard features that was not dislike, but something closer to fear. She did not understand it. She only filed it away against a day when she might. The work itself she loved, and that surprised her. The library at Wexmore was a tall, candle-lit room of dark shelves and a long table, its music collection vast and neglected, 100 years of scores bought and bound and forgotten. She made a fair catalogue and clean copies of the parts that had crumbled. The work filled her hands and her mind, and for the first time since her father's death, she was not afraid every waking minute. She sang under her breath as she copied very low, the way she had sung beside her father at the organ, and did not know she was overheard, for the Earl had taken to coming into the library when she was there. He did it without ceremony and without speech. He would come in with a book or a paper, take the far chair by the cold hearth, and read, or seem to read, for an hour at a time, while she worked at the long table with her candle and her pens. He sat in the silence of his own house with this stranger who wore his dead mother's face, and watched her hands move across the paper. And when she sang, under her breath without knowing it, she would feel the quality of the silence change, and look up, and find that he had stopped pretending to read, and was simply looking at her. His slate eyes steady, his carved face giving nothing away. Then he would rise and go without a word. She told herself it meant nothing. A great man's whims were not for a copyist to read. Yet her body had begun to know the sound of his step in the passage before her. Mine did, and her heart had taken up a foolish, quick rhythm that frightened her more than the dowager did. The county was littered with the ruins of such women. She bent her head over her copying, and resolved to feel nothing, and felt everything, and despised herself for it. It was Souden, the old steward, who gave her the first thread of the truth, by accident. On a wet afternoon in the muniment room, she had been sent to fetch a bound volume of part songs from a chest there, and found the old man at the long table with the estate registers open before him, and his head in his hands. He looked up sharply, and then, seeing only the copyist, let his guard down a little. "You have her trick of standing," he said. "In the doorway, half in the light, she used to stand so." His voice was wondering, and very tired. "Forgiven old man, you will think me wandering who?" "Mr. Souden?" Adeline asked very gently, because she had learned that the truth came to the gentle and fled the eager. "Whose trick?" He looked at her a long moment. Then he closed the register, slow and careful as a man closes a coffin lid. "My sister," he said, "the Earl's mother that was Ideny." He said the name the way one says a word in a language no one speaks anymore. "Her portrait used to hang in the lawn gallery where every countess of this house has hung for 200 years. It does not hang there now. You are not to look for it. I have said too much, and you will forget." "I said it." Adeline did not forget. A copyist's whole art is memory, the holding of a thing exactly as it was, and she held this. Ideny, the Earl's mother, a steward's sister. A portrait taken down from the gallery where it had every right to hang, and hidden behind a painted door under a square of black silk. She held it, and said nothing, and watched, and slowly across the gray weeks of that autumn the pieces began to find one another. She found the second thread herself, in the music. Among the crumbling scores was a manuscript hymnal, a thick, worn book of the kind a country family keeps for its own chapel. The family's names and dates entered on the flyleaves as in a Bible. The last entries had been scored through with heavy ink, blotted out so thoroughly that the names beneath could not be read. Adeline had spent her life reading what was nearly gone, the ghost of a note under a water stain, the pressure of a pen through a page. When she held the flyleaf to her candle and turned it so the light raked across the surface, she could read the impression the pen had left in the paper, under the ink, where no ink could reach. Ideny Colley. The impression read "Married at St. Edris, the 4th of June, and a year," and beneath it, in the same hand, a child's name and a date of christening, scored through like the rest. Married. Not kept, not ruined and cast off, as the county half believed, of any woman whose name was struck from a great family's book. Married, in the parish church, in the sight of God and the law. And someone had spent 20 years, and a great deal of ink, trying to make certain no one would ever read it. Adeline copied the impression onto a clean slip, the name and the church and the day, because that was her trade and her instinct, and folded it into her father's smallest score, and told no one. What she did not yet understand was why a marriage would need to be buried, nor that she was already, without knowing it, the most dangerous person in the house. The dowager understood it perfectly. It was the night of the harvest dinner, the one night of the year Wexmore opened its doors, when the tenants and small gentry came up to the hall to be fed and thanked. Adeline had been kept below a pair of clean hands and nothing more. But Mrs. Pine had sent her up with a basket of mended music for the gallery, where 2 hired fiddlers were to play, and so she was crossing the back of the hall in her grey gown when the Dowager Lady Marborn saw her against the candlelight. The old woman went very still, and then Lady Marborn did a thing Adeline would remember to the end of her life. She turned to the gentlewomen nearest her, the squire's wife and the rector's daughter, and said, in a voice pitched to carry, "Do observe the new copyist. The lower sort grow bolder every year. A girl of no name and no people, given a clean gown and the run of a gentleman's library. One wonders what she imagines will come of it." She smiled. But then, that kind always does imagine. It is the only inheritance they have. A creature of no consequence, given a clean gown. The squire's wife tittered. The rector's daughter looked away embarrassed. And across the bright hall the Earl of Wexmoor, standing silent by the great hearth as he stood at everything, turned his head and looked at his aunt, and then at Adeline, and his face did not change at all, and that was worse than if it had. Adeline curtsied and carried her basket on, and did not let her hand shake until she was through the door and into the dark passage beyond. It was there in the dark that he found her. "Miss Corvenna!" His voice came out of the shadow by the chapel door, low and level. She turned. He had followed her out of the lit hall and stood close, too close, for the propriety of a great man and a servant, and in the dark his slate eyes caught what little light there was. "My lord, my aunt's words were not mine," he said. "I would have you know that. It is no matter. My lord, it was the deflection of her whole life, the smooth surface over the deep water. She is right that I am a girl of no name. One cannot quarrel with the truth. You are not." The words came out of him hard and sudden, as if they had been waiting a long while behind his teeth. "You only do not know your own name. That is a different thing entirely, and you would do well not to confuse them." She stared at him in the dark. Her heart had gone very loud. "My lord, I do not understand you." For a moment, she thought he would tell her. She saw the struggle of it cross his carved face, the thing he carried rising almost to his mouth. Then somewhere behind them a door opened and threw a wedge of candlelight across the flags, and his face closed like a hand closing, and he stepped back into the proper distance, and the moment was gone. "Forget I spoke," he said. "Go to bed." She did not forget. She lay awake under the eaves with her father's scores beside her, and the folded slip inside them, and turned his words over and over. "You do not know your own name." A married woman called Idony, hidden behind a locked door, who wore Adeline's face. A marriage struck from a family Bible. A dowager, who looked at a copyist's face and grew afraid. By the gray of morning she had understood the shape of the thing, though not yet the whole of it. And the understanding sat in her chest like a swallowed stone, too large and too cold to be borne and impossible now to put down. What she did not know was that the dowager had understood it long before her, and had already begun to act, for Lady Marborn had not built her 40 years of rule on cruelty alone. She had built it on foresight. She had known from the hour the music seller's letter named the new copyist's parish that there was a danger riding toward Wexmoor on a carrier's cart. She had sent her own woman to St. Edris with a story and a sum of money, and the page of the parish register that recorded the marriage had been cut clean out with a knife. She had laid her ground the way a general lays his, and she believed, with the serene certainty of a woman whose every plan had worked for 60 years, that it would hold. And to make certain the copyist would never be heard, she had only to make certain the copyist would be gone, in such a way that her word would be worth nothing, for the rest of her life. The silver thimble was Adeline's only treasure, her mother's, and it lived in a twist of cloth, in the small drawer of the library table. On the morning after the harvest dinner, she went to it out of habit, to hold it a moment before she began, and it was not there. An hour later Mrs. Pine came white-faced to the library, Lady Marborn behind her, and Mr. Derry. Tregarra the solicitor behind them both, with a far greater silver, Small chased box from the Earl's own cabinet found, the Dowager said, her voice ringing with sorrowful triumph, wrapped in the copyist's own shawl, beneath the copyist's own bed. I am grieved beyond words, Lady Marborn said, and she did look grieved. That was the terrible artistry of her. But I warned this house, Mr. Tregarrow, you are a witness. She will be given to the constable at Wexbridge in the morning, and the law may take its course. We are too soft in this country with thieves who repay kindness with theft. A thief. That was the word she had chosen, and chosen with care. For there is no charge against which a woman of no name and no people can less defend herself. In the eyes of the county it would be the copyist's word. The bold-faced girl caught with stolen silver under her bed against the word of a dowager countess and a solicitor of 40 years' standing. Adeline understood, standing very straight in the cold library with the chased box on the table between them, that she had been beaten before she ever knew there was a game, and that the truth folded in her father's score would die with her in a county jail, unheard. The mouth that carried it stopped with a charge no one would look past. She did not weep. She did not plead. She found in the worst hour of it that the pride was still there, cold and clear, like water at the bottom of a well. I did not take it, she said, to the dowager, to the solicitor. Pine, who was crying. I have never taken what was not mine. You have put it there, my lady, because I have a face you are afraid of, and because of a marriage at St. Edrith's, that you have spent 20 years trying to make the world forget. The room went utterly silent. The dowager's face did not move, but something happened in her eyes. One flicker, swiftly mastered of a woman hearing the one sentence she had crossed an ocean of ink to prevent Mr. Tregarrow, looked up sharply from his papers, and Mrs. Saller. Pine stopped crying and stared at Adeline as if she had grown a second head. You are raving, Lady Marborn said, but her voice had thinned. Take her below. Lock the door. They locked her in the muniment room of all places, among the very registers that held the proof she could not reach. And there she sat through the long gray afternoon on a hard chair, and did not despair. Quite. She thought instead of the slip she had copied from the hymnal flyleaf, and folded into her father's smallest score, which sat at this moment in her room under the eaves 3 floors above her, behind a door she could not open. The whole proof of who she was, in a book of music in an attic, while she was locked among the registers a thief had emptied. It was very like her life. It was past dark when the key turned in the muniment room door, and it was not the constable, nor the dowager. It was the Earl. He came in alone with a single candle, and set it on the long table, and the small flame lit his carved face from below and made it terrible and tender all at once. He had her father's smallest score in his hand, the slip of paper unfolded between his fingers. Mrs. Pine brought me this, he said quietly. She went to your room. She has more courage than I have had in 20 years. He looked at the slip and then at her, and his voice when it came was the rough, worn voice of the locked study, a man speaking past a great weight. Ideny Cawley, married at St. Edrith's. He set the slip down as if it were made of glass. My mother, I know, Adeline said. It was what he had said to her. The first morning in the study, she gave him back his own words, and saw them land. Sit, he said, and she sat, and he sat across from her, the Earl of Wexmoor and the accused thief, with one candle between them. And he told her at last, the thing the whole house had spent 20 years not saying. His mother had been Ideny Cawley, sister to Sowden the steward, raised in the steward's cottage at Wexmoor, with no rank and no fortune, and a face the whole county turned to look at twice. His father, the old Earl, had loved her against every law of his world, and married her quietly at St. Edrith's that summer, with the steward and the curate for witnesses. For 3 years they had lived as husband and wife, and told no one of rank, while the old Earl gathered his courage to face his family. Roderick had been born of that marriage, the lawful heir of Wexmoor, christened at the same font where his mother was wed. And then Ideny had died of a fever, in the boy's 9th winter before her husband had found the courage to own her before the world. And my aunt found him, the Earl said, in his grief, with no wife to defend the truth, and a boy of 9 who understood nothing. And she made him a bargain. She would manage the family and see the title safe, and in exchange, the marriage would be a thing that had never happened. My mother's portrait came down from the gallery. Her name was struck from the hymnal. Her grave was given no stone. My father, who had not the strength to defend her living, had even less to defend her dead. And he let it be done, and it broke him, and he was 20 years dying of it. He told me the truth on his deathbed and made me swear to write it. And I swore, and then found I was as great a coward as he, because to own my mother was to call my aunt a liar before the whole county and tear up the only peace this house had ever had. So I locked the portrait in my study where I could ask her forgiveness every morning, and did nothing. For 12 years, I did nothing. Until a copyist with her face walked into my library and began, without knowing it, to undo every knot my aunt had tied. Adeline sat very still in the candlelight. The cold stone in her chest had become something that ached and did not crush. And I, my lord, she said, who am I, that I have her face? I do not know, he said, and it was the truth, and she could see it cost him to say so. Kali is not a common name in this county, Souden told me. When you came that his sister Idony had a younger sister besides, a girl who went into service elsewhere, and was never heard of after. He thinks you are her daughter, my mother's niece, and my cousin, and that the blood of this house runs in you as it runs in me. The proof, if it ever existed, was in the register at St. Edred's. And my aunt's woman was there a month ago, and I would not wager a shilling that the page is still in the book. So there it was. The whole shape of it laid bare in the candlelight. She had never been nobody. She was Idony's niece, perhaps, of the same despised and honorable blood, and the marriage that would have proved it had been cut out of the church's book with a knife. And tomorrow she would be given to the constable as a thief, and her word, and the Earl's, and a slip copied from a blotted flyleaf, would weigh nothing against a dowager's silver and a solicitor's seal. She has thought of everything, Adeline said. She has thought of everything, the Earl agreed. She always does. That is what makes her terrible. She has never in 60 years met a thing she could not bury. He stood. The candlelight slid off the planes of his face. She has never met you. And she has made one mistake, the only one I have ever known her make, and does not yet know it. What mistake, my lord? He looked at her a long moment, and something came into his slate eyes. She had not seen there before. A kind of fierce, quiet light, the look of a man who has been asleep a long time, and has suddenly woken. She has forgotten the bishop's transcript, he said. Every parish must send a true copy of its register to the diocese each year by law, to be kept in the cathedral. My aunt could reach a country curate with a purse. She cannot reach the cathedral muniment room 30 miles off at Wexbridge, where the marriage of Idony, Colley, and my father, the 4th of June, has been written for 35 years, and where there is not a dowager in England with reach enough to cut the page. Souden rides for it at first light. And you, Miss Corvenor, are not going to any constable. You are going to stand in the gallery tomorrow night, when the county comes for the Michaelmas assembly, under the place where my mother's portrait hung. And I am going to do the thing my father had. Not the courage to do, and own her, and own you, before every soul in this neighborhood. Let my aunt defend that if she can. Adeline rose. Her knees were not quite steady, but her voice was. My lord, if you do this, you cannot undo it. You will have called your aunt a liar before the whole county. There is no peace in this house after such a night, and you have wanted peace above everything for 20 years. Be certain, I would not be the ruin of you. He crossed the room to her, slow, and stopped close, too close, in the way of the locked study and the dark passage, and for a moment neither of them breathed. I have had 20 years of the peace of the grave, he said very low. I find I would rather have you. He did not touch her, He did not say more than that. He stepped back into the proper distance and bowed to her as a man bows to a lady, which no one in her life had ever done, and took up the candle and left her, and locked the door behind him so the household would believe her still a prisoner. Adeline stood a long time in the dark with her hand pressed flat against her own breastbone over the loud and foolish and no longer despised beating of her heart, and for the first time since her father died into the cold, she was not afraid. The Michaelmas Assembly at Wexmore was the great event of the neighborhood's year, and for the first time in 2 decades the hall was opened to receive it. The long gallery where the countesses of the house hung in their 200 years of paint was lit with 100 candles, and the great families of the county came up the avenue of bare limes and were received to their astonishment by the cold Earl himself, who had not received anyone in living memory. The Dowager Lady Marborn stood beside her nephew in her gray and jet gracious, and faintly puzzled, for she had been told the copyist would be handed to the constable at dawn, and dawn had come and the copyist was nowhere, and Sowden, the steward, had not been seen since the previous night. And there was a thread of something loose in the smooth fabric of her certainty that she could not find and could not pull. She had not long to wait for it. The gallery filled. The musicians tuned, and the Earl of Wexmore stepped up onto the dais where his ancestors looked down in their frames and lifted his hand, and the music stopped, and the long, bright room turned to him in a rustle of silk and a held breath, because the cold Earl had not addressed an assembly in 12 years. "You are welcome to my house," he said. His voice carried without effort to the far end of the gallery. "I have kept this room closed and kept myself closed for reasons that are my own. And I mean tonight to set them down, because I have carried them too long, and they have cost a life worth more than my comfort." He turned and gestured, and at the door, Mrs. Howell Pine drew back a curtain that had hung there all evening, and beneath it, restored to the wall where it had hung for 200 years before it was taken down, was the portrait of a young woman in sea green, with a wide, grave mouth, and gray eyes set a little too far apart, and a small, dark mark at the left jaw. The whole room turned to look at it, and then, one by one, to the gray-gowned young woman the Earl had drawn up to stand beneath it, who had the same mouth, and the same eyes, and the same mark at the same jaw, as if the canvas had stepped down living into the candlelight. "This is the Lady Idony Tremaine," the Earl said. "Countess of Wexmore, my mother. She was born Idony Colley, a steward's daughter of this estate, and married to my father, the late Earl at St. Edris, before God and 2 witnesses, on the 4th of June, 35 years ago. And I was born of that marriage the lawful heir of this house, because she was born without rank. This family, after her death, struck her name from its books, took down her portrait, let her grave go without a stone, and called the truth a folly and a lie. I have let it stand for 20 years out of cowardice. I'd let it stand no longer." The gallery had gone so still that the candle flames could be heard, and into that stillness the Dowager Lady Marborn stepped forward, white to the lips, and the old artistry rose in her one last time. "Roderick!" Her voice was a blade of polished ice. "You are unwell. You have been unwell a long while, and I have shielded it too well. There was no marriage. There is no record of one. I am grieved past words to say it before our friends, but the woman in that portrait was your father's folly and nothing more, and this person has poured a fantasy into a sick man's ear to save her neck. She is a thief, taken last week with my own silver beneath her bed. Mr. Tregaro." She turned to the solicitor with the serene authority of 60 unbroken years. "Tell them there is no record of any marriage at St. Edris." And there it was, her active defense, brought up to bear in the one arena where it had always won. The cup-page, the bribed parish, the charge of theft hung round the only mouth that could speak against her. It was built across an autumn of careful work, and very nearly perfect, and in any other hour of the world it would have held. Mr. Tregaro rose. He was an old, dry, exact man who had served the family 40 years, and he held a packet of papers, and he looked at the Dowager and at the Earl. And a strange thing happened in his exact old face. "There is no record at St. Edrith's, my lady," he said slowly. "That is true. The relevant page has been cut from the parish register with a knife. I examined the book myself this morning, on the Earl's instruction, and the cut is recent." A murmur ran the length of the gallery like wind through wheat. The law of the church, however, requires that every parish send a true copy of its register each year to the bishop, kept in the cathedral, and reached by no hand but the bishop's. The steward Sowden rode to Wexbridge before light this morning, and put into my hands the certified transcript of the parish of St. Edrith for that year, under the seal of the diocesan registrar. He drew a single stiff sheet from his packet, and held it up so the candlelight fell on the seal. "The marriage of the Right Honourable the Earl of Wexmore and Ideny Cawley, spinster, solemnized at St. Edrith's Church the 4th day of June, in the presence of John Sowden and the curate. It is here, my lady, in the bishop's own book, copied 35 years ago, and there is no power on this earth that can cut it out. The marriage was lawful. The portrait is a countess of this house, and the Earl is the lawful born son of it, which I, who drew his father's will, have always privately known." The silence after that was the silence of 100 people understanding a thing at once. And then it broke, not into uproar, but into the low, astonished murmur of a county rearranging its whole picture of a family in the space of a breath. They looked at the portrait. They looked at Adeline beneath it. They looked at the Dowager Lady Marborne, who stood alone now in the center of the bright gallery, with 60 years of certainty falling off her like a dropped cloak, and who opened her mouth and found that for the first time in her life she had nothing to say. She did not rave. She did not fall. She was, whatever else she was, a woman of her order to the last, and she gathered the rags of her dignity about her with both hands. "I did what was required," she said, to no one, to the room. To her dead brother, perhaps. Someone always must. None of you have the first idea what it costs to keep a house standing. And then her composure cracked, just once, and she said more quietly, in a voice that was almost human, she would have brought it all down. "I only ever meant to keep it standing." It was not an apology. It was the nearest thing to one that such a woman could make. The confession of a person whose whole life's labor had just been shown to her as a wrong, and who could not yet bear to call it by that name. The Earl did not crush her. He had been told he must not, by a copyist in a muniment room, and he had heard it. He let his aunt keep her feet and her grey dignity, and said only, level and quiet, the single sentence he had crossed 20 years of cowardice to say. "My mother hangs in the gallery now." He named the restoration, and named nothing more, and it was enough. And the room knew it was enough. Lady Marborne went from Wexmore a fortnight later to a small good house of her own in the next county, with her jointure unreduced and her name unblackened, for the Earl told the county only the truth, and let them draw their own conclusions. She was not destroyed. She was corrected, displaced, and quietly humbled, and many in that gallery had seen her face crack and understood, even as they turned from her, that to lose at 63 the belief one has held for a lifetime is its own hard punishment, needing no other. As for the theft, Mr. Trigueiro made the chased silver box disappear from the record as quietly as it had appeared, and the constable at Wexbridge was never troubled. The only silver that mattered to Adeline was found 3 days later by Mrs. Pine, behind the leg of the library table, where it had been kicked in the haste of its planting, her mother's worn thimble restored to her warm hand. It was Sowden who confirmed the rest. Adeline was Idane's niece, the daughter of her younger sister Marion Cawley, who had gone into distant service and married a poor music master at Hartfell Cross and died young, having told her daughter nothing of the great grim house her aunt had married into, perhaps to spare her, perhaps from a pride as deep as Adeline's own. She had a name, after all, and people, after all, and the old steward who had wept over a register wept again openly this time to find that his lost sister's child had come home of her own accord on a carrier's cart with her mother's thimble in her box. They did not marry quickly, the Earl and the copyist, for there was no need now of haste, and every reason for grace, and a county that had just learned to think well of its lord again was given time to learn to think well of his choice. Marry they did, the spring following, at St. Edred's, at the same font where his mother had been wed and where he had been christened, with Souden, straight-backed and white-haired, to give the bride away. On the evening of their wedding day, Adeline went up alone to the long gallery and stood beneath the restored portrait of the woman whose face she wore. Idaine looked down at her in the soft sea green, grave and young and no longer hidden, a countess of the house at last in her right place in the candlelight. Adeline reached up the way she had reached the first gray morning behind the locked door, and this time her fingers did not tremble, and she touched the small dark mark at the painted jaw, and then her own, and she was not afraid, and she was not alone. And she was, after 24 years of being a girl of no name and no people. Exactly, and finally, where she belonged. The Earl found her there, as she had known he would, his step in the gallery known to her now better than her own. He did not speak. He came and stood beside her under his mother's eyes, and after a while his hand found hers in the candlelight, and held it. And that was all, and it was everything. Outside, the spring dark came down soft over the park, and the avenue of limes, not bare now but breaking, every one of them into the first green of the year. If the long road this woman traveled, from a carrier's cart to a place beneath her own true name, has stayed with you, then keep her a little while in your thoughts before you go. The truth, in the end, is a patient thing. It will wait behind a locked door for 20 years and longer, and when at last it is let into the light, it lights a great deal more than itself.